But for me, getting rid of 80% of a population is massive, is huge, it's a crime.
And was there a discernible pattern in the sense that in today's Israel and Palestine, you see a much larger percentage of the population of, let's say, the Galil, so everywhere from the north of the West Bank northwards, the percentage of Arabs that remain there relative to the Jewish population is much higher than in the south. So do we have a historical explanation for how that happened?
We do. The Jewish forces reached the Galilee in the end of 48. And they were tired, they were exhausted. The Palestinians already knew what awaited them, so they put a fight. That's the only places where Palestinians really fought against the expulsion. It was much harder to expel them in the Galilee than it was in other parts.
So you're saying in places like Lidda and Ramle, they didn't see it coming to the same degree?
Lidda and Ramle is another story. They relied on the Arab Legion. You know, if the Arab Legion would have stayed in Lidda and Ramle, there would be a bloody battle. But they decided to withdraw and left the population unarmed, so they couldn't do much. So they thought the Arab Legion would defend them. And the Arab Legion they left in one day, the next day they were occupied and expelled by the orders of Rabin, who said Ben-Gurion. You remember the famous movement with a hand that Ben-Gurion did to Rabin, just kick them out. In Galilee, they came later.
So is it that the populations of Galilee had learned their lesson from the rumors?
Few things. They learned the lessons. They had a close proximity to Lebanese villages, so people from Lebanon came and helped them. It was much easier.
Literally, they came
across to help them.
The border with arms?
Yeah. You remember there was no border.
Right.
There was no border. This is the last stronghold of the Arab Salvation Army of Kaouji. He made the final stands. It was tougher. It was ethnic cleansing. It was tougher, and I think that's one of the reasons that in Operation Hiram, the operation that closes the war in the north, October 48, some of the worst atrocities were committed by the Jewish soldiers, including rape, killing of pregnant women, and massacring people by tying them up one to another and throwing them into pits.
Because of a sense of desperation at that point?
Yeah, because they lost people. While ethnically cleansing, they lost people. So it was revenge. It was revenge in Safsaf, in Sassa, in Zetoun. And these, by the way, are, again, Morris, to his credit, Morris does not believe in anything but Israeli documents, which I think is ridiculous. I think Israelis are big liars, and I wouldn't trust the documents more than I trust the oral history of the Palestinians. But then, never mind. To his credit, wherever the Israeli documents admitted the massacre, he registered it. And the massacres of October 48 shocked quite a lot of people, especially in Mapam, we mentioned them before. And that's why he could find, I remember when Morris worked in his book, the Israeli military archive was still close to him. So he went to the Mapam archive, where soldiers associated with Mapam had their, and ministers close to Mapam, had their memoirs, diaries, and so on, and he used them. And they really pressured Ben-Gurion to investigate the atrocities done in Hiram, in Operation Hiram. And they were very graphic in their description of what the soldiers did, which is really horrific. And the reason they did it was because they encountered
more fierce resistance?
Fierce resistance. This is also one of the only places where the Israelis used extensively their airplanes to bombard Palestinian villages to cause people to flee. One of the persons was the famous Abi Natan, who bombarded to death Tarshiha, a village that survived. It's still with us today. Israelis could not get rid of them, the Tarshiha people, so they allowed them to stay. So
that suggests there really was this time and logistical pressure to accomplish this as quickly as possible. This is, from your perspective, as quickly as possible. But in the course of that, because people had clued in, it was harder to do it effectively. So you saw less effective ethnic cleansing and more retribution. Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah, it's a fair assessment. Then when the war subsides, the few villages like Ikrit and Bir'im and Rapsiya and Kaditha, a few villages where the army says we cannot allow Palestinians to be in these villages, they are too strategic. And then they do something terrible. It's about 6 or 7 villages. They convince them to leave the village. They tell them, go for 2 weeks. The army needs to survey the villages. And they destroy the village in those 2 weeks and tell the people, unfortunately, you cannot come back because we had a military exercise here in the village, unfortunately. And because the army did a mistake, to 2 villages, it made the promise in writing, Ikrit and Birim. So they went to the Supreme High Court in Israel. And after years and years of struggle, the Supreme Court said, you're right. The army promised you to come back. And the Supreme Court said, if the army agrees, we don't mind if you go back. Well, the army doesn't agree. So, but this is just a settler colonialist movement, like the Zionist movement, when it becomes a settler state. We saw it in South Africa, also in the United States and Canada. They adapt themselves to new realities. For example, you cannot genocide Native Americans at a certain moment in the 20th century. You cannot hunt down Aboriginals anymore in Australia at a certain moment. So you use other means. In Canada, you kidnap the kids and you send them to schools, supposedly schools, where they're really morally tortured and abused. Okay, you don't kill them, but you kill their soul. The native people in the world really were victimized by settler colonialism on a level that is as bad as the Holocaust. But they're not allowed to say it. They're not allowed to say it. There is only
they're
now
not allowed to make that direct
in Canada
comparison,
you don't have a memorial museum for the genocide or whatever was done to the First Nations.
Not yet. I'd like to think we're getting there, but it's been a slow
I hope so.
process. Yeah.
America only now is willing to look at African American. I mean, the Holocaust of the slaves was worse than the one in Germany, was much longer, the numbers were higher. Of course, each case is horrific by itself. The German modern industrial nation doing this is, who can, my family was lost there, so I know what I'm talking about, but this idea that you could really downgrade what happened to the native people, and in case of Palestine, you downgrade it because the victimizers are Jews. That's the main problem for the poor Palestinians have no chance because the people who abused them were the ultimate victims of the 20th century. And they have, for some reason, the world thinks that they are the ones who have to pay the price for this. That's why Israel was absolved in 1948 from the crimes it committed, still is absolved from the crimes it commits against the Palestinian people. And remember, there's always a pretext. The Israelis will tell you, there's suicide bombs, there's terrorism. We're not doing it out of a plan. It's retaliation. It's retaliation. It's interesting. Israel always needs a pretext. But when you check the retaliation, you see no connection between the act and the retaliation. And then you think, so maybe the retaliation is part of something bigger. I'll give you an example.
You're saying there's never any connection? Or there's
hardly any connection. If I throw a stone, even if I stab you, and I come from a village, you cannot punish the whole village for the fact that I stabbed your brother or sister.
Well, you can. It's just illegal under international law.
You can, but it's not because it's a retaliation. The collective punishment serves something deeper.